Welcome to the Alchemy Consulting Group podcast. Join Arquella Hargrove, Alchemy's Chief Culture Officer, for impactful conversations with business leaders and experts who are committed to transforming their work cultures and creating inclusive work environments. Let's learn, develop, and garner best practices together. Enjoy this episode. Hi, everyone. My name is Yvonne Harris. I'm co-founder of 21 Media, and I just want to thank you all for joining this episode of the Alchemy Consulting Group podcast. And in order for us to start, we have to introduce our host extraordinaire, Arquella Hargrove. Arquella, how are you?
I am wonderful. I'm glad to be here. Glad to be kicking off our podcast for Alchemy Consulting Group. Thank you, Yvonne, for the kickoff. I'm excited.
Yeah, absolutely. Really excited for all the great things that you're going to share during this podcast. And I know one of your formulas or your secret recipe is that you are leveraging this podcast to highlight the expertise of many of your collaborators and business partners. So I know that you have one joining the line today. Would you like to introduce your guest for today?
Awesome. Yes, absolutely. So Diana Candelaria Reyes is a friend and a collaborator. I forget how long we've been knowing each other, but we have worked on many projects and traveled together. And so I'm excited to have her join us today. I'm going to ask Deanna to share a little bit more about what she's up to these days as well and her genius.
Thank you. Thank you, Arquella, for having me. And yes, several overnight stays and flight delays and all kinds of fun stuff in our journey together. But yes, so our group works in the space of obviously diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging, and in a couple of spaces within that. So strategic planning, which I think is something we're going to spend some time talking about today, and then executive coaching and leadership development.
Well, again, thank you, Deanna, for sharing just some of your background and some of the areas of your expertise and what you provide and to make an impact in the world. And again, I know that one of your areas and your jam is strategic planning. And I know we've been on different projects related to strategic planning for client groups. And so my first question to you is, how do you see strategic planning efforts changing in light of diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging, because we always like to see how that mirrors and how that aligns to ensure that it is part of the DNA. And also, when we think about strategic planning, to make sure that it is living and it's breathing and helping to move the organization forward. And so, I want to hear from you on how do you see these efforts changing in the landscape of all that's happening within DEIB?
I'm so glad you asked that question. And you're right. It is changing. It is evolving. You know, traditionally, strategic planning has been more of a top-down approach, right? Where leaders will go on some kind of retreat, right, or some escape for a couple of days and come back with the magic plan, right? And that edict has traditionally been kind of top-down with top-down accountability, a bit rigid. And what we're seeing now is a new approach around bottoms up, an approach that is more collaborative, that is more inclusive, that is more agile. And the big differences are that the whole team is involved. There's more of a shared direction rather than top-down direction, and more peer accountability across the different business lines or the business services. And so those are some of the things that we're seeing in practice. The other thing that we're seeing, and you alluded to this in your question, Arquella, is that it is more an iterative live document. Oftentimes in the past, we've seen strategic plans that kind of sit on a pretty bookshelf in file 13, right? And so now we're seeing that they are live, they're iterative, they have red marks and highlights and scratches as they're being practiced and done and then redone. So that's one piece. The other thing that I think we're seeing is technology coming into place. And so, you know, there's been a lot of talk on AI and ChatGPT and all this stuff, the whisper technology. And so one of the things that we're seeing in strategic planning efforts now is leveraging that technology to help gather and analyze the data earlier on. And so that's giving the teams, ideally the diverse, equitable teams, time to focus on the writing and operationalize that plan. And so rather than the groups in the past spending time digesting and synthesizing that internal and external data, now they're having an opportunity to be more productive and really focus on a plan that is workable.
You are definitely speaking my language. And I remember, again, back in the day when I was, again, working for a global energy company, yes, we would have folks come in and do the strategic planning, the beautiful binders up on the shelf, and they would stay there until the next time. And it's like, what? What's our plan? How are we going to make it happen? And so now it's definitely more, again, as you said, bottoms up, and it's more collaborative, it's more inclusive, it's including our teams for sure. And so that is where we find success and the opportunity to make sure that we are putting it into practice as far as kind of what's happening within the organization. So, Deanna, one of the resources that we really looked at for this conversation is by Courtney Thornton and David King, Inclusive Strategic Planning, Moving the Needle Toward Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion. And something that really stood out for me, or they highlighted, again, similar to what you were saying, is that the strategic planning process really should foster an inclusive culture, and it is involving and engaging employees at all levels, even customers and other key stakeholders in the conversation about the organization's strategic direction. And when you get the different voices in, yeah, definitely people are feeling included, and definitely you're going to get the buy-in, and that's what we want as part of the planning process. And so my next question to you, and thinking about what should leaders be thinking about when working towards a strategic plan that incorporates the diverse, equitable, and inclusive principles, really leaning into some of those core values or core behaviors to make sure that this is realized for all employees?
Yeah, no, Arquella, I'm really glad that you mentioned that resource, because that is a go-to that kind of does a nice job of summarizing. But when you talk about the incorporating the diverse, equitable, inclusive principles into strategic planning, there's really three pillars, if you will, that I like to go by. And the key word in that is shared. Shared. So we talk about shared experience, we talk about shared story, and then shared outcomes. And so you'll notice, even with that name, right, we're talking about something that's engaging, ideally a governance that has diverse voices and diverse constituents, where we're looking at scenario planning, we're looking at competitive advantages. We're getting, if it's a municipality, right, we're getting public input. And so there, in that shared experience that we create in that first part, the idea is less control from the top, and it's more like influencing or pushing from behind, or as a supporter, right? So it's a different position than the leaders or the executives have been in the past. And then, of course, the governance I mentioned earlier, right? Ensuring that we've got diverse voices and they're heard and they're included in the decision-making process. The other piece with that shared experience is oftentimes we hear this word silos, right? Our company has silos, our departments have silos. And so the idea is, with this effort of this engagement, whether that's a series of meetings or a retreat or bonding opportunities, however the organization chooses to pursue that, the idea is that when we have this strategic engagement across all departments, we're working to eliminate those company or organizational silos. And the idea with this shared experience is it needs to be exciting, right? And so oftentimes we'll have groups take a look at the external, and there's a number of tools, that we've all probably heard of, but to look at what's going on externally, what's going on in the government, in the social issues, and the environmental issues, and kind of have a broader lens. I like to say looking up and looking out, because oftentimes, as you know, we see organizations that get kind of those blinders on and tunnel vision. And so, after organizations go through an experience like that, they typically come up with 3 or 4, pillars that they're focusing on. The second piece that we focus on is around this idea of shared story. Okay. And yes, that is the output, the deliverable of the strategic plan. But the idea, to what you said earlier, is that it's got to be accessible and visible. Right. And the two differences there to make that accessible and visible is socializing that plan. I read a quote not too long ago that talked about 2% of employees regularly share their personal brand, their employer related brand messaging, and more than 33% are unclear about what's supposed to share about the company. That means they don't know the direction that they're going, what their organization is standing for. So I think it's really important to socialize that plan and get a sense of what are the influencers that are showing up in order for people to get excited and jazzed about it. And the third piece that I think does a good job of incorporating the DEI principles is this idea of shared outcomes. And that really is tracking and communicating results. And oftentimes we know that gets left off, right? And so that's that ongoing goal reporting, communicating results, celebrating those milestones, and really having that feedback loop from your diverse, equitable, inclusive organization, right? That's coming back and saying, this is working, this is not working, hey, we need to pivot here, rather than just that top-down approach. So the idea is this belongs to us as an organization, and we're all taking a part in creating it, in building it, in executing it, and then monitoring the progress on it.
I don't know about the audience, but that was wonderful. Thank you, Deanna, for just sharing and breaking down again those 3 pillars and really the approach when we think about strategic planning and think about it differently, and definitely how to make sure that we're moving the needle within our organizations to ensure that, yeah, our goals and objectives are met, as well as, again, ensuring that everyone has an opportunity to get their voice heard and get the buy-in. Definitely, I think is key. And something else too that just really resonated is one is the decision-making factor, and again, being able to have everyone be a part of the decision. There's the communication, there's transparency, there's accountability. And so all of those 3 pillars that you share definitely embraces those different attributes that we should see as part of that process for sure. And so I want to really ask you, you did allude to this earlier, but it's the tools and techniques, right? As we're thinking about how to drive change and how to move our strategic plans forward, is that you mentioned AI, and I've used Miro, like the Miro boards again, so everyone has an opportunity to participate, and it's a fun way to do that. Also, when we have all the employees, that again, we have everyone in the same room and everyone is being tasked to focus on certain pillars and how they're able to, put some actions around that. And then again, it's the gallery walk around. And so again, those different activities to bring this alive. But what are some other helpful tools or techniques that you would recommend?
Yeah, so for sure, you said Miro, and I love that tool. First, I want to say that frameworks like the traditional stuff that we've used in strategic planning, scenario planning, SWOTs and balanced scorecards and OKR, they still are relevant. So I'm not saying those need to be pushed aside. I think there's ways that we can do them differently when we've got virtual groups or when we're trying to make our groups more inclusive. And you mentioned some of those online resources. But the other thing that I think has evolved is now we're looking at it from a lens of more of like 90-day sprints, right? That are live and iterative. And so we're looking at things like their objectives and their key results and their targets and their focus areas, right? So the core is still there. But whereas in the past, it used to be we were looking at 1 to 3 year goals. I think now it's 90 days to 12 months. And having that iterative approach. And I think that's really in line with our life in general, right? Nowadays with people's attention spans and, things that are committed to, like people have a hard time thinking about 3 to 5 years from now, right? And so, having those relevant for the here and now, but also having the long stretch goal. The other thing is measuring progress and accountability, right? So holding ourselves accountable for creating positive change and allowing that space and time to recalibrate, right? It's okay to say this is not working and we need to back up and pivot. Um, and then I mentioned this earlier, but I can't stress how important it is this idea of continuous improvement and feedback, right? So how are we cascading the message across community partners, internal employees, external stakeholders, right? What feedback mechanism have we put in place? And then what ideas can we consider to better meet the evolving needs of the organization and community we serve, right? And really be mindful and give that some serious thought. I think sometimes we see organizations ask, their stakeholders, whether that be internal and external, for feedback or, ideas, but are not really taking those seriously, right? So we'll walk those ideas through the 5 or 6 steps that they would require to execute, and how would they play out?
I think that's key, definitely. And just to your point, as leaders of organizations, it's really to keep a pulse on what's happening. And again, if it's a living, breathing strategic plan, definitely there's many things that will cause a company to shift, right? We think about AI, like everyone now is like, okay, how do we incorporate AI into our business processes and systems, right? And so, or other market trends and factors, we want to make sure again that we are able to flex and adapt based on what's happening. And then two, I have client groups that do the 12-week year, and so that's how they manage their strategic planning and their goals. Or to your point, the 90-day sprints, I have a group recently, it's the 100-day sprints. And so whatever works, and definitely continue to ensure that you're on track and making those adjustments as necessary, I think is key. Deanna, talk about how do you see organizational connectivity shifting through strategic planning? What are some of those, again, shifts that we need to look at?
Now, this topic of connection and people connection, right, really, I think hit a kind of a bubble, right, when we were in the middle of COVID, and we continued to see the importance of connectivity. And so when we think about the opportunity with strategic planning and organizational connectivity, I think there's a couple of pieces that bubble up. Number one is the opportunity for enriched culture. Um, and so it's another key area to dive in, meaning it gives everyone voice, right? And that means we could do one-on-one interviews with people, we could do focus groups, we could do surveys, right? But there's an opportunity to continue to enrich that culture through connectivity as we are working on the strategic plan. We talked about AI already and how that's another way to give people voice through AI. The other thing, though, I think is it really is a mindset shift, meaning that we're open to new ideas and alternative viewpoints that may have not been our go-to or our comfort routes like they have been in the past. Um, yeah, so I think that the mindset shift is probably the first place to start. And then when we think about the people, right, the people, I'll call it the people goal or the people pillar, right? Are we thinking about employee development? Are we thinking about retention, right? What are we putting in place that allows for that equitable growth and advancement? Are we thinking about the recruiting and hiring processes that remove the barriers and the constraints for certain underrepresented groups? So all of those pieces that are talked about often, right? But I think the first piece is starting with the mindset shift and really aiming toward trying to create an enriched culture and another mechanism to improve the connectivity, the connection within our organization through the exercise of strategic planning.
That is so key, right? Everything starts with the mindset, for sure. So, definitely making sure, again, we are having those conversations or taking leaders in our teams through mindset shifts, and what does this look like? What does it feel like? And how do we incorporate it into what we're already are doing? And so that is key in this strategic planning process. One thing, too, you mentioned around that the development of talent. and continuing to invest in leadership development, talent management. And this helps to ensure that that organization has the capabilities to navigate the changes that are happening, or to make sure that they're able to execute on the strategic planning process. And so, Deanna, I want you to talk about how leaders can position their organizations to navigate strategic plan changes. And one thing just to, again, to think about is that we know that a structured change management process can really facilitate those smooth transitions. Definitely, we know that it involves planning for change, communicating the change, implementing the change, and then monitoring and adjusting as needed. And so, again, if you can just lean in and talk about how leaders can position the organizations to navigate these changes, what's their role, what are examples that have been successful that you can share with our audience?
I think, Arquella, this is my favorite question of all, around change, because of what I have found is that organizations, more often than not, underestimate what change really looks like and feels like. And so, like you said, we call this change readiness. And, to be able to anticipate and adapt to these transitions quickly or quicker, right, is gonna mean the difference. Is gonna mean the competitive edge. And so, to be clear, I'm talking about people change, meaning people changing or adjusting or modifying their behavior. I'm not talking about their values. I'm talking about their behavior in response to the plan. And so, oftentimes, we'll do like a change readiness assessment to get people to kind of visualize and feel what that change might look like. Oftentimes, I'll hear organizations say, "Oh, we want to grow, a gajillion times, but we want everything to stay the same." It's like, well, that's not going to happen, right? And so things are not going to be exactly the same if we want to make such a significant change. And so it kind of takes a minute for people to say, "Oh, do I really want that? Do I really like that? What is that going to feel like? It's going to feel different. It might be uncomfortable." Yep, you bet. Are you sure you still want that? Right? And so that's kind of a bit of a tough exercise for organizations to get their brains wrapped around. But it's incredibly important, because if not, as you mentioned, we'll get stuck, right? We know that we've got to have the willingness and the desire, right, to have that agility, to have that flexibility, even when it's uncomfortable, to navigate those changes in the plan. But if we don't have that reality check, right, we're gonna have some bumps and bruises, and then you can kind of get into the knowledge of what is that really going to incorporate. Exercises like scenario plannings, or the what ifs, or if then statements, right? What would that look like? Let's flush out our options. And then recognizing as an organization, right? Do we have the ability to make those changes? When do we need to get outside help? When do we need to swap players, right? When do we need to get some counsel on, do we have not only the capability, do we have the competency, the capacity, for those changes in the strategic plan? And then, like you said, at the very end there, the last piece is really that regular reinforcement. Again, that goes back to the monitoring and evaluating and communicating, right? Are we getting, when we talk about diversity, when we talk about things being equitable and inclusive, are we getting that feedback from the stakeholders? Or is it the same voices? Right? Is it the same voices that we're hearing? Are we making an intentional effort to get that holistic feedback?
That's great. Great. I like it. I like it. It's great. Over a good overview for sure, and just a good reminder. I was thinking about one of the prompts I like to use when working with teams, right, to keep them in the brainstorming and just really thinking outside the box when we are planning. It's the yes and, right? Let's keep thinking about it, right, and that helps with that mindset shift to a growth mindset, and just keep thinking bigger and outside the box. So again, we think about how we move the organization forward. And just again, thank you, Deanna. Just some great tips and strategies for us to really think about. And when we do adopt these strategies, what we find is that leaders can position their organizations to be more agile and resilient and prepared to adopt and adapt these strategic changes, ensuring long-term success and sustainability. And one of my favorite quotes that I like to share with leaders as you are going through this strategic planning process is by Simon Sinek. And he is like one of my favorite thought leaders. And he says it best, that great leaders state out loud what they intend to do. And in doing so, they get things done. And that's all what we're focused on. When we think about strategic plan, we have to be able to move our organizations, our businesses forward. And with that, we need the plan in place to execute on. So Deanna, if you can just to share as we're closing out, just some words of encouragement or just some things that leaders can take away so they are able to apply the strategic planning process and thinking to their next strategic plan process.
Yeah, and I love those statements that you just said, Arquella. And I think it's a good reminder, right? When we talk about strategy, we're talking about it being creative, imaginative possibilities. But when we're talking about planning and operationalizing, we're talking about control, and that really means choices. So as leaders, right, what choices are we going to do? What can we do, and why are we going to do it? What's the purpose and the intent behind that, right? And I think that those two pieces can really anchor leaders as they are progressing forward in their strategic plans and thoughts.
Thank you. And
Deanna, please mute.
Lastly, Deanna, if you can just to share how our audience can connect with you and learn more about the great work that you're doing at CRC Consulting, and especially around the important work of strategic planning. So if you can share how the audience can connect with you.
For sure. So thank you for asking, Arquella. So you can find us online, CandelariaReyesConsulting.com. I know that's a mouthful and a really long name. And you can also find us on LinkedIn. On our site, you can find a few different resources around strategic planning and some case studies that may be helpful. And we'll have an article coming out later this year with some kind of DIY, do-it-yourself practices. Thank you. Thank you again for having me.
Awesome. Thank you, Deanna. Looking forward to all the great things that are yet to come, and looking forward to hearing updates as it relates to strategic planning and definitely how it aligns, it integrates for sure within our organizations. And thank you all for listening. Again, this is Arquella Hargrove with Alchemy Consulting Group, where we work to help transform one culture, one business at a time. Thank you.
Thank you for tuning in to the Alchemy Consulting Group podcast. Follow this podcast on social media and help continue the conversation by sharing your business and leadership best practices. Subscribe to this podcast wherever you consume yours, and share this podcast with your organizations and networks. Let's strengthen the community of those committed to responsible leadership and work environments where everyone can thrive.